Bo, I am so excited for you to be here. And I was going through because Jack was just back on the podcast, and he actually said that you called him while I was interviewing him. So it was it's just been fun because the rename of the podcast, and when I reached out, and I'll even give you a little I'll warm you up for the audience because you're like, I don't know if I've got anything new to talk about. And I said, you know what? How much I've learned since I read your book, Finish Big, which we read after we sold the business, and what I learned, and I was just like, and how I've gone down on this rabbit hole for the last 5 years because of the book, and realizing that it was a true thing out there for the owners who don't know what they want and why. And I just am so excited to have you on the show again because...
Well, I sort of feel like I should be interviewing you, Ryan, not the other way around.
I wasn't prepared for that.
So you sold the business 4 years ago, was it?
It was in 2014 now. Yep.
So that was you and your dad, right?
Yep. And it was July of 2014. And it's...
Wow.
Yeah. And what year did the Finish Big book actually come out? I don't know if I actually remember what year it came out.
I'm not sure I remember either. I think it was in something like, it was sometime around then. I don't really remember. I could look it up.
It's all good because you don't even have to look it up. The point of why I brought that up is because I read it afterwards. It wasn't like the book came out after we sold. It was I read the book after, and I don't even remember who gave it to me. Honestly, it looked like it came from like a used library. Someone had like got it and then gave it to me. And I think it's important for the listeners to know that, because when I read it, it was like I got this peer into what I had, the emotional journey I'd gone through or was in the process of, honestly.
Right.
And
sure.
And I think because I've talked about it, and I've probably over the years, morphed the stories, and it's all on record, so we could go and validate it. But can you just, almost revisit to the audience, like, why did you write it? Like, what came from it? Like, what was the problem that you saw? Because it's obviously the same problem that I have seen and still see, and it's still there, which is just crazy interesting to me.
Well, it came about sort of through the back door. I mean, I was writing a column with Norm Brodsky for Inc. magazine. It was a monthly column, and so every month we'd have to sit down and figure out what we were going to write about. And one month he came back from a conference where he'd spoken to some people who wanted to buy his business, and he'd sort of laid down some conditions that he didn't think they would agree to. And they said, they didn't bat an eye. They said, yeah, sure, we can do that. And so he said he told me that he thought he was going to go ahead and sell it. Now, this is a shock to me because he always loved his business so much. He loved spending time in it and just working on it. And I had a hard time imagining what Norm was going to be like without his business. So I said, well, maybe we should write about that. And he said, yeah, sure, fine. Why not? Well, we later discovered that there were actually a couple of reasons not to write about
just a couple
selling your business in real time. But that came later. I mean, that came when he was in negotiations, and people would turn to him and say, if I tell you this, you're going to wind up in Inc. magazine next month.
Yeah.
And so
not just your neighbor, but like the entire business community, right?
Right, exactly. And so it was very interesting. It was interesting experience, one that I don't think either one of us had anticipated or realized was going to happen, because it sort of took on a life of its own. I mean, what was going on was that Norm was agonizing about whether or not he really wanted to go through with this. And he went back and forth. And at one point we asked readers of Inc. magazine, we knew that there were a lot of people who were following this. And we asked them, what's your advice? What do you think Norm should do? and we got a ton. We got hundreds of emails back, most of them saying, "Go ahead, Norm, go for it, sell it." And so that told me that there was a lot of that there was from the response that we were getting to this series of columns, I could see that there was a lot of curiosity about, well, what's this experience like when you go through it?
Mm-hmm.
And so after we got in the end, it was funny because he finally decided, yes, he was going to go through with the sale. And so the editor of Inc. thought that was big news because so many people were watching it, and she put it on the cover, a big cover story, saying Norm decides to sell, and it's sort of like the deal of a lifetime, and so that was exciting. And then we still had another column to do for the next issue after that, and so I waited a while, and then I called him up and said, "Okay, Norm, what are we going to do next?" And he said, "Well, I decided not to sell the company." I said, "What? We just told millions of people that you decided, you made up your mind that this is a deal of a lifetime." And he said, "Well, I found something out that really sat the wrong way with me." He said, "They never told me who the real decision maker was. And there was one guy in all our meetings who I absolutely hated, and I didn't think I could trust him at all. But he was just one guy among a whole bunch of people, and so I didn't really give it too much thought. And then I just found out that he is the guy who's going to make all the decisions about honoring any agreements. And I don't trust him. I don't think I can count on him to do it. I mean, they made a lot of commitments vis-a-vis my employees, and I can't trust them to live up to that." And I said, "Okay, well, I guess
we got a column."
I guess we got a column. And it's true, the next column was about how he decided he wasn't going to sell. At least he wasn't going to sell to that buyer at that time. And at that point, he still thought it was, and he was right, that the timing was right to sell the business. And so he was going to continue looking for a buyer, but we decided it was probably not a good idea to keep this series of columns going on while he was doing that. So he eventually did sell it, and the saga went on, but we just didn't write about it in real time. We wrote about it afterwards. And so from the response that we'd gotten to this series, I thought, gee, that's very interesting that people are so fascinated with what's going on with Norm. And people have gotten like emotionally involved with this. And so I went to my publisher and I said, I thought there was a book there. And he said, "Yeah, why don't you write a book on exits? That could be a good book." And I said, "Okay, well, I guess I better start writing it." And so my agent and my publisher worked out a deal, and I began doing my research. Well, the first thing I realized was that what I knew about exits was one thing, namely what happened to Norm, because Inc. We never wrote about exits. Everything we wrote about was about starting companies, growing companies, and so forth. And I thought, well, gee, I better educate myself so that I can write a book. And I said, how am I going to do that? I said, well, I do know what Norm went through. I've got to interview some other people who've been through this to find out, what the experience was for them. And so I began talking to people, and I wound up talking to, dozens and dozens of owners that who had left their companies. Most of them sold their companies. And I really just asked everybody I knew who knew somebody to let me know. And, I began getting a lot of suggestions. And I suppose the first thing that struck me was how many of the people I talked to were unhappy and wish they hadn't sold their businesses. And, were having were full of regrets, or there were parts of the whole experience that they didn't like. And I would say it was, I thought it was about half and half, but people tell me that I was probably being too conservative. It was probably more than half who had regrets afterwards. And so I said, well, I guess that's my book. What's the difference between the ones who wind up happy and the ones who wind up, full of remorse about what they've done? And so that became the book.
What I thought was amazing about that book, and I want to, because you've got 4, and then you kind of have this *5 that are the reasons of what people did to be happy. But I think I'll explain to you, Bo, that like 4.5 years of this, and hundreds of interviews, and I can pretty much say you're right. And and even like not only doing my interviews with business owners and also advisors. I mean, it's probably half business owners and then a fourth authors and then a fourth advisors. But like, there's a lot of regrets or frustrations, and then I had my business model that I was evolving over time, trying to create the business model to help solve this problem. And like, the crazy part was of the absolute like visceral reaction people have about the word exit. And and you're going to talk about why people want to, like, what they need to know. They need to know about themselves and why. But like, I've been trying to like, essentially slide in to help educate owners. And like, it's just this, like, almost like two of the polar opposites of magnets, just like bouncing away from that, which is the name change on the podcast, my company. And the crazy part is like, I found, Bo, that it's themselves. And I want you to explain your 4 and 5, but like, I was never a technical finance guy. Like literally, right. I was a sales guy, strategic. I'm the visionary kind of DNA. And I went straight down these rabbit holes over the last 4 years because I realized that to essentially have the freedom to choose, you have to understand this, to understand who's sitting across from you, how the choices and the different data points connect. Otherwise, it's going to just like not happen the right way. Like it's just, I don't know. Yeah. As you explain your 4/5, maybe give some comments about the word exit or what you've seen.
Well, I've definitely seen that, and it was one reason why we didn't mention the word exit in the title. It took a while to come up with a title, actually, but what you're saying is exactly what John Warlow ran into. Because originally he called his site after his book, Built to Sell. And that's how he wound up starting it. And he began to get some traction on that. And then after starting this new business called Built to Sell, which I wrote about and Finish Big, he realized that somehow this was turning people off and that he had to switch it around. And so he said he started calling it Value Builder. And it turned out that Value Builder, people were fine with Value Builder, even though it was exactly the same content as Built to Sell.
Intentional growth. Here I am.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, it's great.
And so you're absolutely right about that. The thing I found was, as you mentioned, that there were certain, when I looked at what I'd come up with after I'd done all that interviewing and sort of gone through the transcripts of the interview and really sort of thought about what it was that I'd found, I realized that there were actually certain things that the people who had bad exits either did or didn't do that the people who had good exits did or didn't do. It was the opposite of what the people who had good exits were. And I had to define what I meant by a good exit. And I decided that, there were like 4 or 5 characteristics. Number one, that you felt like the process you'd gone through in selling the business was fair and that you'd been rewarded for what you'd put into it. And number two, which was related to that, was that you could, if you could look back and take some pride in what you'd done, that you'd created something of value to the world. And that you could really take some satisfaction about how you'd spent your life. And number three, you felt fine about what had happened to all the people who'd been sort of on this journey with you. And number four was that you'd succeeded in making a transition to whatever you were going to do afterwards. And then for some people, there was a fifth one, which was the company was continuing to go on and doing very well without you, which, for some people that was very important to have happen because, well, aside from everything else, it showed that you had done one of the most difficult things in business, and taken your company through the biggest transition that it was ever going to have, namely the change of ownership and leadership, and that it was. So I decided that was in those 4 or 5 qualities defined a good exit. A bad exit is when you didn't have one of them, and it only took one of them to give you a bad exit. So I then said, well, okay, now let's look and see what the people who had good exits did in order to have that good exit. And I came up with, as you say, 7.5 different qualities. The first one was what you talked about, namely knowing who you are, what you want, and why. Which was something that I also found with Small Giants, which was another book I wrote, which was that people who have a clear idea in their own mind about who they are, what they want, and why are able to make decisions that are going to make them happy, whereas otherwise you wind up making decisions based on other people telling you what they think you should do. And so that was number one. And then number two was that it was important to build a sellable company. And by sellable, I meant that it was that your company, you were able to sell your company to whom you wanted, when you wanted, and why. And no, when you wanted and for an amount that you considered fair. And, that was certainly, there are some things called forced sales where
happens a lot, or out of blue offers, or that people go all the way down and they wish they wouldn't have. And
it's absolutely right. And then a third one had to do with giving yourself enough time. That as you know, Ryan, a lot of people they don't want to think about their exit. And then suddenly they get to a point where they're, 70 years old or whatever it is, and they realize, gee, I'm going to have to get out of here. And they think,
by golly, who would have thought?
And so they call up their lawyer or their accountant and they say, listen, I'm ready to sell. And they say, well, when do you want to sell? And they usually say, well, I'd like to sell, I don't know, 6 months. And it turns out to be not nearly enough time. And that's particularly true if the way you plan to sell requires you to have a successor. Because if you need a successor, the chances are you're going to fail the first time. In all the people I interviewed, there was one person who the first time actually chose a successor who turned out to be absolutely the right successor. Everybody else who did need a successor brought in somebody.
A couple bruises along the way.
Brought in somebody who, they later found out was absolutely not right. And they had to sort of take the lessons they learned from that and go back and find another successor. Another, I guess number 4 was I found it was important to have the right help and the right advice. Since you're embarking on something that you've never done before, chances are you've probably never done before, and you don't know how to do it. It's totally different from building a business. It's a a whole other discipline.
Different job, different.
Yeah, it's a different job, exactly. And you need to have someone advising you about this who has been through it. And that's why I became such a fan of peer groups like Evolve in Chicago, where you could meet with people who were thinking about this or who had actually gone through it themselves and could talk to each other about these very, very personal issues, and that you could trust them. That was that I found was critically important. I mean, when you sell a business, you're going to need lots of help from all kinds of professional people, like lawyers, insurance people, wealth managers, and so forth. But I found that it was particularly important to have some way to sort of be guided by somebody who had actually been through it themselves, because among other things, that person understood that it wasn't over when you
did the wire
found a buyer.
Yeah,
that actually you still got a whole way to go before you. And then the next thing, I guess I don't know what I'm up to. I guess the fifth thing.
Yeah.
The fifth thing was that what I talked about before was the importance of thinking very, very carefully about what is going to leave you at peace. Whatever happens, the sale of this business is going to affect a lot of people, not just the owner who's selling. And it was very important to think about in advance about how it was going to affect other people and to do by them whatever it was that you needed to do so that you're at peace afterwards. It was a big thing that led to people feeling unhappy afterwards was they'd look and see what happened to these other people who'd been on this journey with them all these years, and it had not worked out well for them. And then the owner would feel tremendously guilty and carry that around with him or her for a long time. And then the next one was really the importance of doing your own due diligence. I mean, everybody knows that when somebody comes to buy a company, one of the things they're going to do is look very, very closely at your company and do a lot of due diligence. And what people sometimes forget is that they've got to do just as much due diligence on the buyer as the buyer is going to do on them, because it's very important to understand why it is that the buyer wants to own your company. And buyers have different motives. I mean, maybe they're buying your company for their intellectual property, and you don't necessarily know that. And of course, in the process, they're telling you how great your people are and how wonderful the things you've done in the business are. But what they really want to do is get your intellectual property. And then if you haven't prepared for that, if you haven't seen that and realized that was going to happen, then you haven't prepared adequately, because things are going to happen after the sale, which you're not going to like, but you're not going to have any ability to affect them. It doesn't matter, and legal documents have no significance or very little significance in this context, because if the buyer starts doing things that you don't like, you go to your lawyer and say, well, wait a minute, they said they wouldn't do this in the contract. And the lawyer says, because usually there's a certain amount of money that's in escrow, and the lawyer usually says, well, that money you have in escrow, and you say yes, and they say, well, do you want it? And of course, it's usually a big part of the sale. So of course you say yes. They say, well, then don't make waves about this, because if you do, that's going to jeopardize your ever getting the rest of what you're owed for your company. And then the last one, really the seventh, which is very, very important, in many ways, the hardest part, which is making the transition. If you've spent your whole adult life or your, years and years and years building this business, there are a lot of things you're getting out of it that you don't realize until you don't have it anymore. I mean, when people ask you what you do, you say, well, I run this company and, well, here's what this company does and so forth. Or, the people you go and see every day, it's easy to take them for granted.
Your social network, your identity. It's just
exactly your identity, your purpose. And suddenly all these things are gone. And if you haven't gone back to that first one of figuring out who you are, what you want, and why, you're going to run smack into it at that point. You're going to find yourself saying, wait a minute, who am I? What do I want? And why? And
how does that impact my business, my money, the value, like everything?
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting, Bo, and I want to relay, because I don't know if in the emails that you and I exchanged back and forth, if you totally grasp the 5 principles, because I want to explain the journey that I went on, because after I found out your, kind of the 4 things that happy people did, and then the kind of the 7 things that you have to really take into account. One of the things that I struggled with was, okay, how now? How do I actually figure out who I am? How do I actually figure out what to work on? And because it's like, it was so true. Like I read your book and I was like, like not, I got my head probably, I had to go to the chiropractor pretty much because I was nodding so much. And so the 5 principles were synthesized, probably similar to how you created these over all the years and the interviews. And it was really about trying to like, okay, what needs to be learned and consumed to make those decisions. So the first one, and then I'll tell you like how a comment of how someone would articulate this. And then I want to get into kind of the small giants, and then what are ways to get through to owners? Because I think those are some of the biggest challenges. But so the 5 principles came from Bo. It's like, okay, and they go in order of like, so the first one is your drivers. What do you want and why? And that kind of is right from you. And we have all these assessments of like, hey, is it legacy? Is it identity? Is your social network? Is it disrupting industry? There's all these reasons that someone chose to do this. Right. And then someone answers these questions, but then you have to stack on, which is the second principle of your financial targets. And there's 3 of them. What is your target annual income, cash flow? And then what is your second one is your net worth outside the business, because you might have tons of real estate or investments. Then the third one is the value of your company and understanding how that impacts your financial situation. Because then you can layer it on top of your first principle is to say, how much do I actually need? And then to be able to quantify how much I want, like quantify me staying in the business, not staying in the business to a dollar amount. And so that's why we dive in. We teach so much on valuations. And then the third principle are the exit options. And this is where I think things get fun, and where I think what Jack Stack is literally a shining example of how someone could get all the things that they want. So the five exit options are, one is internal. So that could be management, partnerships, or family. The second one is what we call acquisition entrepreneur, like a search fund. So someone that wants to come in and buy a job for the most part. And then the third one is an ESOP. It's selling to your employees. And then the fourth one is private equity. And that could be family office would fall into that. So, professional investors. And then the fifth one is a strategic buyer. And the concept that needs to be absolutely understood going into that is the difference between your leadership role and how you get paid for that versus your ownership stake. Because there's transitions that could be done differently on both of those. And I think what I've run into, Bo, is that so many people, when they say exit, they're literally thinking I'm getting kicked to the curb and that's my exit. However, you could literally, like in this example, if what was really important to you, principle one was my employees and my legacy, and I literally love this business. And then the financial targets, you've pretty much accomplished a lot of these, and you only need maybe half your value up front. You could then sell to your employees where you're selling the ownership, but you're running the company till the day you die. And that's technically not an exit in the way that a lot of people think about this. So these first first three principles set up the framework to literally identify what do they want and why. And then principle 4 is increase value. So now you know what you want and why. Let's grow your EBITDA and your multiple and pay down debt in the direction that you want to go. And then the 5th principle is how to hire a team of advisors that are going to optimize that plan. So instead of getting, going to your attorney or your CPA or wealth manager, all these people, and them telling you what you think you should do, you go to them and you say, oh, here's what I want. And so one of my favorite phrases is this client of ours who's gone through the digital course, or who's like the boot camp digital course. He consumed the material and he said, Ryan, I want to go so he's doing 10 million in revenue right now and 1.2 in EBITDA. And he's saying, you know what? Right now, I don't want to sell to a strategic because it's right now only worth $5.5 million and he would only net 2.5. And he would probably have to sell to a strategic buyer that would not all the legacy things. And if I can go from 1.2 in EBITDA to 2, I will go from a $5.5 million valuation to 12, and I'll go from netting 2.5 to netting 8. And then I can do an ESOP in 36 months and sell to my employees. And then I'll have 36 months to hire my transition, my leadership role. It's very specific. And then everything falls into line with where they want to go. So that's kind of like the how to actually dive into it. But the craziest challenge that I've had, which goes into like the small giants and then just teaching people this, is getting through to people that are like just grinding day to day to understand this. I've spent like every waking minute for the last 6 years trying to figure out marketing phraseologies to get through to people. And it's about driven me mad, honestly.
To get through, tell me more about that, Ryan. What do you run into when you talk to people?
Well, and this is what Jack Stack and I talked about. I don't know if it was on the record or off, is that there's so much noise out there. And like you have these owners. So like one of the biggest things is there's like, I'd say 90+% of business owners have their mindset optimizing for annual income. So how much distributions and what's my K1 going to be? How do I minimize my taxes? But what they're doing is they're sacrificing long-term value growth. Right. So like, and I actually did this podcast recently about the psychology is actually brain science, where the flow is like, it's almost like an addiction of like loving what you're doing.
Right.
But to think about an exit or any of this other stuff is almost like doing estate planning, where people like, do that. So there's like, you're almost fighting human behavior while also the fact that people they're solving for the annual income. So the goal is to try and get through to them that this actually creates a whole different paradigm shift that opens up more options. It's just been the hardest thing ever. And they'll say like, hey, EOS is solving all my problems, which is totally bullshit. I mean, it's a great operating system, but it doesn't solve these problems.
Right.
Or there's someone that they hired that allowed them to shut off all the receptivity to other things. What is your thoughts on, or experience with that?
Well, I'm actually just, I'm thinking, well, you know, Allie Taylor.
Yep. She's actually coming back on the show too. You're pretty soon.
Oh, good. Yeah, she should, because she knows a lot, and she's taught me a lot actually about sort of psychologically what it is that gets in the way of people. I mean, I think that you're right that for many people, thinking about the exit is like thinking about their funeral. And you've got to get beyond that, because they have a hard time thinking about what's going to happen, what they're going to do afterwards. And
that's like assuming that they have to leave the role. And that's where I want to, that's a good bridge to the small giants community that you and Paul have created, and Ward and what Jack's doing, because like, and I think the one question that I asked you years ago was, can you finish big and be a small giant? And it almost literally leads you up to an ESOP because it's like, so.
Well, actually, I've been very involved with another group somebody you probably want to interview is a guy named Dave Wharton, who is the WHORTON, and he is the founder of what's called the Tugboat Group. And if you go online and you look for Tugboat Institute, you'll find it. And it's similar to Small Giants, but the difference is a lot of these companies are not particularly small. There are a number of people who are in both Small Giants and in Tugboat, but there are other people who really, I mean, they're worth billions of dollars, and
that's not small.
That's not small. But they have what they call the 7 Ps, which are, I actually wrote about them in Inc. Was the last article I wrote for Inc. In 2015. Their 7 Ps are, let me see if I can get this right. Purpose.
I'm gonna be impressed.
Purpose, people first, profit as a measure of basically added value. In other words, how well have you added value to your customers?
Mm-hmm.
What else? What am I missing? There's something called pace growth, which is sort of what Jack does, which is not fast growth, not focusing on fast growth, but focusing on growth over time.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's
profitable.
Yeah, it's profitable, and also, if you grow, 10 or 15% a year, or 8 or 10% a year, you may not wind up on the Inc. 5000, but over 30 years, you're going to get to be very, very big and generate an awful lot of cash.
Versus Jack, I mean, you want to get Jack going, you tell him that the pre-seed valuation is $10 million. You can get him going.
Yeah, right.
Get 1,000% growth with no cash, right?
Right, exactly. And then another one is what they call pragmatic innovation, which is that you innovate not by throwing a lot of money at something. In fact, money sort of undermines innovation, because if you can solve problems with money, you will. If you have to solve them with your own hard work and creativity, it's harder. But that's where the lasting innovations come from.
Yeah.
So anyway, I've been spending a lot of time with Tugboat, and these are companies. The members of it are known as evergreen companies, and that is companies that last for years and years and years, and that the goal is, if you have a young company in it, these are companies that, they want to last for at least 100 years and what have you. I mean, there's one company in Tugboat that's been around for 300 years. It was originally chartered by the King of England, and it's been in continuous existence for the same family. I happen to be related to this family, but that is totally coincidence, and it's still going strong. Obviously, if you're going to be around for 300 years, you're going to have to do a lot of innovating along the way.
Well, you're not going to. It's so interesting, Bo. It's like, so a couple of the things when I noted in the email to you asking to come back on is, I read the book Conscious Capitalism, and it changed. I was just like, totally makes so much sense, and it's really hard to find these veins in our culture that are like, hey, by the way, you can make a lot of money and do a lot of good at the same time. Because I thought, when I was reading the book, or even people I've interviewed, it's like the nonprofits have to go find the capital from someone else, so you might as well create something in the platform you have with customers and vendors and suppliers and all the people in your community. Like, you have a better chance and a bigger leverage with owning the company, continuing to generate cash than a lot of nonprofits do. And it's just, and so the Tugboat Institute sounds a lot like that. And another book that came out that just validated it for me was Simon Sinek's new book, The Infinite Game. He actually mentioned the finite problems with the private equity timeline of 4 to 7 years. And then also the quarterly reports of the public companies, which look at it right now. We have a fourth or a third that they're called zombie companies because they're not making any freaking money. And it's like it goes back to what you're like, just focusing on the right things. And it's just interesting to find that there's these things starting to come out that are enough people that finally go through the process and are not happy with it.
Yeah, right. I think that, the other thing is this, is that, that if you are going to, if you are starting a company with the goal that you want it to last as an independent entity for 100 years, one thing that is that you're not going to be there when it happens. So you're still going to have to deal with the transition. Now, some of these businesses are family businesses, and there are a lot of great family companies out there. And basically, when I wrote Finish Big, I looked very hard for companies that had lasted beyond in other words, they lasted to the third generation. In other words, it's possible to find a successor who is going to run the company. Let's say is going to buy the company and run it the way the original owner did. To go to a third generation is almost impossible. Mm-hmm. In fact, the only companies that I was able to find that were able to do that were either family businesses or employee-owned businesses. Mm-hmm. And my theory about that was that someone needs to be the protector of the culture and the way of doing business. And that in a family-owned business, it's the family that, not that all family-owned, I mean, there are a lot of, not very good family-owned businesses that go out of business, but in a long-lasting family-owned business, the family plays that.
Yeah, of what are our core values? And Simon Sinek, and without being fluffy about that too. Simon Sinek says that in his book, and he actually gave some examples of some big public companies where, if you don't have someone essentially playing whack-a-mole with all the the cancerous decisions that could pop up in a company for short-term thinking, you have to actively actively go after that stuff.
Yeah. Well, with the we'll see what happens with Jack, obviously. Well, we won't see it. You're younger than Jack and I, so you may see it. But, there's going to be a transition there. And people have, Jack has been, he always polls everybody to ask them what they want. And even though he could probably figure it out on his own, and what they want is to keep doing what they're doing. And to get bigger and create more opportunities and so forth. And at some point, he's going to have to leave, That's all there is to it. I mean, he's not going to live forever. So there seems to be a general consensus, actually, that his son, Tim, is the logical successor. And he's got two sons in the business, and the older one is also named Ryan. He has no aspirations to run the business or anything like that, and he thinks his younger brother, Tim, is the person who's best equipped to do that. And there's a lot of people who sort of share that feeling. But in any event, there's got to be something that keeps you going beyond any individual. And I've talked to Jim Collins about this, actually, and it's one thing to do it in a public company because you have shareholders and you have a board of directors that's fairly powerful, and and so forth. It's another thing to do it in a private company, and all of the companies in Tugboat are private.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's another P. That's
there you go.
That's another P, was private, because he is somebody. He's an interesting guy himself, because he's a Silicon Valley venture capitalist. He was at Kleiner Perkins. He was the right-hand man of John Doerr at Kleiner Perkins, and but he basically believes that companies that you have to be private in order to really have this sort of long-term focus.
You don't have analysts that are like constantly judging your quarterly earnings and
right.
Well,
right.
What's also interesting with that, Bo, and this is where, like, I have gone to the nth degree of diving into understanding valuations and numbers and all that stuff, because when as I kept pulling this thread, is like the friction and the objections I kept getting, it was because, like, once you actually understand the numbers, then you can start making decisions. And a lot of, like, I read one of the big financier books, The King of Capital, with Blackstone's rise of private equity. Oh my gosh! But like, the challenge is when you're too small, or or people don't understand value, and they don't understand the difference between ownership versus W-2. Human beings just go to their lowest common denominator, which is fight for survival, and arguing over things they don't understand, which is the value. Or like when you explain that thing with Jack Stack, it's like, well, they're all owners. So like, they're going to do what's best for the company instead of best for themselves, because they're all going to benefit from it. And so like, and I think about the problems when you get to the lower end of the spectrum, where you do these without doing an ESOP, you do these internal transfers, the taxes and how it suffocates the cash flow of the company, you almost can't at the same. Yeah. So there's just like this whole like problem of like being able to facilitate these things that is a whole different probably interview in itself. But
well, you know that it's one thing to give people ownership. It's another thing to teach them to understand ownership. And that is hard. That takes years. And ownership isn't all wonderful. There are a lot of responsibilities that comes with ownership. And there are times when you have to do things that you may not want to do, like you may have to come up with cash at a certain point and so forth. And so to really understand it is, I think that the great game of business has become very, very widely utilized among employee-owned companies, because it's basically a system for teaching
finance
ownership. And Jack always talks about how his goal is to build a business of business people. He wants everybody in the business to be a business person.
I love it. It's like the best mission, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
So as we're kind of wrapping up here, Bo, the big kind of question that I've had is like, how do you teach more of that? Like what Jack's, like other than having Jack, who owns a company, who then can almost ingrain into the culture of teaching business people. I've run into problems with the word exit and like trying to get through to people before they get an audible offer or something happens, where they can truly grow value, to create more options, to like be able to articulate what they want. I mean, with your small giants and with these, like, how have you seen, where do business owners become the most receptive to like learning, and what differentiates the people that truly like to understand what they want and how to learn these things?
Well, that's a tough one.
I thought you had an easy answer for me and everybody.
I think there's certain things that it's easy not to think about, and you can go a long time without thinking about them. But life has a certain way of making you think about certain things, because in fact, none of us live forever. And, there are certain questions you're gonna you're going to be forced to answer at a certain point, even if you don't particularly want to answer them. And that happens. Of course, I think that what you're doing, what you and your partner are doing, it can be very valuable to people in terms of getting their heads in the right place to actually deal with all of these things. But don't mention that this is about exiting.
I know it's like the most authentic, caring bait and switch ever, right?
Yeah.
It's like this is not to sell you a get rich quick pill. This is like, hey, there's a lot of work after this, but like
yeah, right, exactly. So I think with small giants, once a lot of small giants, they wind up selling some stock or all of their stock to an ESOP or to their employees. There are some companies, the ESOP isn't the only way to have employee ownership. There are other ways, and some people prefer them and look for them. But once you start sort of getting in there, you start thinking about, well, if you're still there and your company is running fine and it doesn't really need you anymore, which is, of course, the goal, then there are other things you can do. I mean, there's a company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which might be a good company for you to interview. It's called Atomic Object, and their design and I think they're a digital and design company basically.
Okay.
And they have instituted an employee.
I know who they are. So my friend of mine, I'll have to. Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about, and they came up recently in a conversation, actually.
Yeah, Carl Erickson is.
That's awesome. Are they in the Small Giants community?
They're both in Small Giants and in Tugboat.
My friend, he would know who he's talking. That's awesome. That's validating on a lot of fronts.
And I don't know the details of what they've done, but I do know that they're pretty happy with it, and I know that Carl is. He's off doing lots of other things.
Well, I think even to validate your point, but like if someone really enjoyed sales or they're an engineer and they wanted to, go more into design or whatever it is, if it doesn't rely on you and you've got your financial targets met, you could go back in and do whatever you want. I mean, that's
right.
The whole point, right? Like,
yeah. Well, that's great.
This has been fun. I appreciate you so much for coming back on. And
well, I appreciate you, Ryan, for everything that you're doing. And actually, it's very interesting to me to hear how what you've been doing has evolved and to see how it's evolved over the years.
One Thursday podcast email at a time, right?
Right. I guess so.
Well, if you're a listener in right now, I know that you've got your own mix of things that make you happy and what you're doing day to day. But if you were to put them in touch, I don't know if it's Small Giants would be the best place for them to go or any of these places. You got any, or obviously get the book, Finish Big and Small Giants. Any other suggestions that you'd have for the listeners?
Well, every business is different, obviously, and as you well know. And people sometimes ask me, what are the most important management innovations that I've seen? I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I really think that the most powerful business tool that I have ever seen has been open book management, at least as it's practiced by Jack Stack at the great game of business. People get confused a little bit. They think open book management just means making your numbers available to people, and most people couldn't care less about your numbers. I mean, it's like they find it all boring. And the real challenge is to do something like Jack has done, to get
It's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. And the second one, I also am a fan of Zingerman's in Ann Arbor, and they have a visioning system, which has been, which I think is very powerful. And if you haven't talked to them, you should talk to Ari Weinzweig. And then I also think that things like the Net Promoter Score, which is figuring out basically how to measure things that are difficult to measure, and I really think that those three things are really crucial.
So the last question I would have for you then, Bo, is what does the word intentional mean to you?
Well, I don't have any great insights into that. Intentional means to me it's something you want to do and that you plan to do and that you make an effort to do. Why? Why do you ask?
That's the name of the podcast, and it's I would say that like part of my definition so far has been when someone says what's intention, I'm like, you understand who you are, what you want, and why, and then you get a plan to go get it.
That's it. That's good. That's great, Ryan.
This has been so fun. Thank you so much for coming back on, Bo. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Ryan, and we'll be in touch.